Hello and welcome to the Sleepy Evolutionist, where evolution meets relaxation and where deep time gets cozy. Tonight, we're drifting gently across the vast sweep of time to explore the greatest evolutionary gamble ever attempted, the epic story of how your ancestors invented sex. It's a magnificent tale of cosmic risk-taking that spans 3.8 billion years, a story so profound and beautiful that it might just help you drift into the most peaceful sleep, knowing you are the living, breathing result of the most successful bet in the history of life itself. Before we begin, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Whether you're tucked into bed in London at midnight or settling down for an afternoon rest in Sydney, we're all connected by this remarkable story, this thread of continuity that links every living thing across the vast epochs of time. If you find this journey through deep time as soothing as I hope it will be, I'd be ever so grateful if you gave this video a like and maybe even subscribed. It really helps this quiet corner of evolutionary wonder grow, where we explore the grand chronicle of life at a pace that won't disturb your rest. Now, I do hope this isn't so fascinating that it keeps you awake, contemplating the magnificent gamble your ancestors took. But if it does, well, at least you'll have learned something profound about why you exist at all, why you feel attraction, why you dream of love, and how the greatest risk in the history of life became the foundation of everything you are. This video is for educational and relaxation purposes only, and is not intended as medical advice. So settle in. Let your breathing slow to match the rhythm of deep time itself, and allow yourself to drift on the cosmic currents that carried your ancestors through billions of years for the most beautiful risk-taking imaginable. Let's begin this gentle journey through time. In the beginning, there was no gamble at all. 3.8 billion years ago, as our planet slowly cooled and the first tentative sparks of life began to flicker in the primordial oceans, your earliest ancestors lived lives of perfect, predictable simplicity. Picture, if you will, a vast, quiet ocean, warm and gentle, where the very first cells drifted like peaceful dreams made manifest. These ancient ancestors of yours, these first brave pioneers of existence, knew nothing of the complex dance that would one day be called sex. They simply existed, and when they grew large enough, they divided themselves in half, creating perfect copies, identical twins floating in the cosmic soup. Imagine the profound tranquility of this existence. Your 3-8-billion-year-old ancestor was like a living meditation, a single cell containing the entire instruction manual for life, floating in an ocean that sparkled with possibility. When the time came to reproduce, it was as simple and peaceful as cell division itself. One becoming two, two becoming four, like ripples spreading across the surface of eternity. There was no courtship, no competition, no complex rituals, just the quiet, methodical doubling of perfection. But here's what makes this so remarkable, what connects you so intimately to these ancient moments. Every single cell in your body today still carries the memory of this original simplicity. When your cells divide during healing, during growth, during the constant renewal that keeps you alive as you sleep, they're using the exact same process your ancestors perfected 3.8 billion years ago. As you lie there now, billions of your cells are quietly dividing, copying themselves with the same precision your earliest ancestors used, a living meditation happening within you as you rest. This was life's first strategy, and it worked beautifully. For hundreds of millions of years, across vast stretches of deep time that dwarf human history, your ancestors lived this way. They were like peaceful monks of the cellular world, copying themselves perfectly, maintaining their genetic manuscripts with devotional precision. There was something almost sacred about this simplicity, this refusal to change, this commitment to preserving the perfect blueprint of existence. Yet even in this perfection, the seeds of the greatest gamble were already being planted, because in the quiet vastness of those ancient oceans, some of your ancestors began to encounter a problem. Perfection, it turned out, had a hidden vulnerability. As the environment slowly changed, as new challenges emerged, as microscopic parasites evolved to exploit their predictable nature, some of these perfect copies found themselves trapped in their own success. They were like libraries with only one book, no matter how perfectly preserved, still vulnerable to the fire that could destroy everything. And so, as millions of years drifted by like slow, peaceful dreams, the stage was being set for the greatest evolutionary innovation of all time. Your ancestors were about to discover something that would change everything, something that would transform reproduction from a meditation into a dance, from safety into adventure, from certainty into the most beautiful risk ever taken. 3.5 billion years ago, in the quiet depths of those ancient seas, your bacterial ancestors discovered something that would change the very nature of existence itself. They began to gamble. Not consciously, of course. These were still simple cells living their simple lives. But they stumbled upon a process so revolutionary, so fundamentally different from anything that had come before, that it would eventually lead to every kiss, every embrace, every moment of attraction you've ever felt. Picture your ancestor now, a tiny bacterial cell drifting in the warm primordial waters. Unlike its predecessors, this adventurous little pioneer had developed something called bacterial conjugation, the ability to literally reach out to another cell, connect with it, and exchange genetic information. Imagine two cells coming together, like dancers meeting for the first time, touching gently and sharing parts of their very essence, their genetic codes mixing in ways that had never happened before in the history of life. This was the first tentative step toward what we now call sex, though it was still incredibly simple. Your bacterial ancestor would extend what scientists beautifully call a pilus, essentially a tiny bridge toward another cell. Through this bridge, genetic material would flow like whispered secrets, like love letters written in the language of DNA. The receiving cell would incorporate this new genetic information into its own genome, becoming something slightly different, something that had never existed before. Think about how revolutionary this was. For the first time in the history of life, an organism was choosing variation over perfection, risk over safety, novelty over predictability. Your ancestor was essentially saying, I could make a perfect copy of myself, but instead I'm going to try something completely new. I'm going to mix my genetic information with someone else's and see what happens. It was the first bet ever placed in the cosmic casino of evolution, and it was your ancestor who placed it. The beauty of this process lies not just in its innovation, but in its intimacy. These bacteria weren't just randomly mixing genes. They were actively seeking each other out, drawn together by chemical signals, engaging in what can only be described as the universe's first form of attraction. Your ancestor could sense when another cell had something valuable to offer, and it would move toward that cell with something remarkably close to desire. And here you are, billions of years later, carrying within your cells the direct descendants of those pioneering bacteria. Every time you feel drawn to another person, every moment of chemistry, every spark of attraction, you're experiencing an echo of that first bacterial conjugation 3.5 billion years ago. Your gut bacteria, the microscopic partners that help you digest your food and maintain your health, are still engaging in this same process, still reaching out to each other, still exchanging genetic information like ancient love letters. The profound connection doesn't end there. The very mechanism that allows your immune system to adapt to new diseases, to learn and remember threats, evolved from these early genetic exchanges. Your body's ability to heal, to change, to respond to new challenges, all of it traces back to these adventurous bacterial ancestors who chose to risk everything for the possibility of something better. As those millions of years drifted past like slow, peaceful thoughts, bacterial conjugation spread throughout the microbial world. Your ancestors became part of a vast, interconnected web of genetic exchange, sharing innovations across species, across vast distances, across geological time itself. They were like cosmic librarians, constantly updating their collections, adding new volumes, creating genetic libraries of unprecedented richness and complexity. But this was still just the beginning. The real gamble, the bet that would change everything, was still to come. Your ancestors were about to take the principles they'd learned from bacterial conjugation and transform them into something so beautiful, so complex, so fundamentally different from anything that had existed before, that it would eventually give rise to every form of reproduction we see today, including the very process that led to your existence. As we drift forward through deep time, approaching the 2 billion-year mark, we encounter one of the most profound moments in evolutionary history. Your ancestors were about to invent something called meiosis, a process so elegant, so sophisticated, so perfectly designed for creating genetic diversity that it would become the foundation of all sexual reproduction. They were about to make the greatest evolutionary gamble of all time. 2 billion years ago, in the quiet depths of ancient oceans that shimmered with possibility, your ancestors faced a choice that would determine the entire future of complex life. They had learned the art of genetic exchange from their bacterial predecessors, but now they were about to take this concept and transform it into something infinitely more sophisticated, infinitely more beautiful, and infinitely more risky. Picture your ancestor now, no longer a simple bacterium, but a more complex cell, a eukaryote with a nucleus containing carefully organized chromosomes. This ancestor faced a fundamental challenge. How do you combine genetic material from two individuals without doubling the amount of genetic information with each generation? How do you maintain the delicate balance that allows life to function while still gaining the benefits of genetic mixing? The solution your ancestors developed was nothing short of genius. They invented meiosis, a process of cellular division that is like a cosmic dance of chromosomes, a careful choreography that would make genetic recombination not just possible, but beautiful. During meiosis, your ancestors' cells would undergo a transformation so elegant it resembles a meditation made manifest. The chromosomes would pair up, embrace each other, and literally exchange pieces of themselves, creating new combinations that had never existed before. Imagine the profound intimacy of this process. Deep within your ancestors' cells, maternal and paternal chromosomes would find each other like long-lost lovers, aligning perfectly along their length. Then, in a process called crossing over, they would literally swap segments of DNA, pieces of their very essence, creating chromosomes that were combinations of both parents' genetic information. It was like genetic poetry, written in the language of life itself. But the true genius of meiosis lay in what happened next. After this intimate exchange, the cell would divide not once, but twice, reducing the chromosome number by half. Your ancestor was creating gametes, specialized cells that contained exactly half the genetic information of a normal cell. This was the ultimate evolutionary bet, because these gametes were essentially incomplete, unable to survive on their own, able to continue only by finding and fusing with another gamete from another individual. Think about the profound vulnerability this represented. Your ancestor was creating cells that were deliberately incomplete, deliberately dependent on finding a partner. It was like writing half a poem and trusting that somewhere in the vast ocean, another half-poet was writing the complementary verses. The risk was enormous, but the potential reward was even greater, the possibility of genetic combinations that could adapt to any challenge, survive any catastrophe, overcome any obstacle. And here you are, the living proof that this impossible gamble paid off. Every cell in your body carries the evidence of meiosis, the careful record of chromosomal crossing over that occurred in your parents' reproductive cells. Your genetic makeup is literally a love letter written by meiosis, A unique combination of your ancestors' genetic wisdom that has never existed before and will never exist again in exactly the same form. Even now, as you rest, your body is preparing for the continuation of this ancient process. If you're capable of reproduction, your reproductive organs are quietly creating gametes through meiosis, carefully reducing chromosome numbers, facilitating crossing over, preparing half-poems of genetic information that someday might find their complementary verses. You are not just the product of the greatest evolutionary gamble, you are an active participant in its continuation. The beauty of meiosis extends far beyond reproduction itself. The genetic diversity it creates is what allows populations to survive diseases, environmental changes, and other challenges that would wipe out genetically identical populations. Your ancestors' invention of meiosis is why humans survived the ice ages, why we adapted to different climates and environments, why we were able to develop the cognitive abilities that allow you to understand and appreciate this very story. As the eons drifted past like peaceful dreams, meiosis became the foundation for increasingly complex forms of life. It was the key that unlocked multicellularity, the innovation that made possible the incredible diversity of life we see today. But for your ancestors, in those quiet moments 2 billion years ago, it was simply the next step in an ongoing experiment, the next bet in a cosmic game that they were slowly learning to play. The gamble was made, the genetic dice were cast, and the universe held its breath to see what would emerge from this beautiful risk. Your ancestors had no way of knowing they had just invented the process that would eventually lead to every form of sexual reproduction on Earth, including the very process that created you. 1.8 billion years ago, as the vast epochs of deep time continued their slow dance through eternity, your ancestors achieved something that would have seemed impossible to their simpler predecessors. They learned how to become two and then become one again, how to exist as separate individuals while still maintaining the ancient dream of unity. They invented the first true sexual reproduction, the first genuine fusion of two complete beings into something entirely new. Picture this moment, if you will, as one of the most romantic in the entire history of life. Your ancestors, now complex eukaryotic cells with sophisticated internal structures, had mastered the art of meiosis and were ready to take the next step. They had learned to create those specialized gametes, those half-poems of genetic information, but now they faced the ultimate challenge of bringing two of these incomplete cells together in perfect harmony. The process was like a cosmic dance of cellular courtship. Two of your ancestors, each having carefully prepared their gametes through the elegant choreography of meiosis, would release these specialized cells into the ancient oceans. These gametes, carrying half of each parent's genetic information, would drift through the warm, primordial waters like messages in bottles, each one hoping to find its perfect complement. When two compatible gametes finally found each other, what happened next was nothing short of miraculous. They would recognize each other through sophisticated chemical signals, ancient molecular handshakes that confirmed they were meant to be together. Then, in a process that can only be described as the universe's first kiss, they would fuse completely, their cell membranes dissolving into each other, their cytoplasms mingling, their genetic materials combining in perfect harmony. This fusion, this syngamy as scientists call it, created something that had never existed before in the history of life. It created a zygote, a single cell that contained the genetic wisdom of two completely different individuals. Your ancestor had literally become a living library containing two complete collections of genetic information, carefully organized and perfectly balanced. It was like two symphonies playing together to create an entirely new musical composition. The profound beauty of this process lies in its perfect balance of risk and reward. Each parent was contributing their most precious possession, their genetic legacy, to create something they would never be able to control or predict. They were writing genetic poetry together, but neither author would know how the poem would end. It was the ultimate act of faith, the ultimate expression of trust in the future. And here you are, the direct descendant of billions of these successful fusions, carrying within your cells the living memory of every single one of these ancient romantic encounters. Every nucleus in your body contains exactly the same balanced combination of genetic material that your ancestors achieved through sexual fusion 1.8 billion years ago. You are quite literally the product of an unbroken chain of successful cellular love stories stretching back across geological time. Think about the profound implications of this. Every time you feel the desire to connect with another person, every moment of longing for intimate union, you are experiencing an echo of these ancient cellular fusions. The very chemistry of attraction, the way your body responds to the presence of a potential partner, all of it evolved from the molecular recognition systems your single-celled ancestors used to identify compatible gametes in the ancient oceans. Your immune system still uses variations of these same recognition mechanisms to identify which cells belong to you and which are foreign. Your reproductive system still relies on the same basic principles of gamete fusion that your ancestors invented 1.8 billion years ago. Even your brain chemistry, the neurotransmitters that create feelings of love and attachment, evolved from the molecular systems that made these first sexual fusions possible. As millions upon millions of years passed like slow, peaceful dreams, this process of sexual fusion became increasingly sophisticated. Your ancestors developed better ways to find compatible partners, more efficient methods of gamete production, more reliable mechanisms for ensuring successful fusion. They were learning the intricate dance of sexual reproduction, step by step, generation by generation, bet by bet. But they were also discovering something even more profound. Sexual reproduction wasn't just about creating genetic diversity. It was about creating possibilities that neither parent could have imagined alone. It was about combining different solutions to life's challenges, different approaches to survival, different ways of interacting with the world. Your ancestors were not just reproducing, they were innovating, creating novel combinations of traits that could adapt to an ever-changing world. The stage was now set for even greater adventures. Your sexually reproducing ancestors were about to embark on the next phase of their cosmic gamble, the development of specialized sexes, distinct male and female forms that would make reproduction even more efficient and even more beautiful. 1.5 billion years ago, in the vast quietude of deep time, your ancestors faced a puzzle that would lead to one of the most profound innovations in the history of life. They had mastered sexual reproduction, learned the elegant dance of genetic fusion, but now they encountered a question that would reshape the very nature of existence itself. Why take such an enormous risk? Why abandon the safety and certainty of asexual reproduction for the unpredictable gamble of sex? The answer, as your ancestors slowly discovered, lay in the ancient arms race between life and death, between your genetic lineage and the microscopic parasites and pathogens that sought to exploit and destroy it. Picture your ancestor, a complex single-celled organism floating in the warm ancient seas, facing an invisible enemy that was constantly adapting, constantly evolving new ways to infiltrate and damage living cells. If your ancestors had continued reproducing asexually, creating perfect copies of themselves, they would have been like a vast city where every building was identical, every lock the same, every defense mechanism predictable. Any parasite that learned to exploit one individual could immediately exploit every member of the population. It would have been a catastrophe of perfection, a beautiful uniformity that was also a fatal vulnerability. But sexual reproduction changed everything. By mixing genetic material from two different individuals, your ancestors were constantly creating new combinations of genes, new molecular locks, new defensive strategies that no parasite had encountered before. They were like architects who designed every building differently, locksmiths who changed every combination, generals who varied every battle plan, Sex became life's ultimate strategy for staying one step ahead of death itself. Imagine the profound elegance of this solution. Every time your sexually reproducing ancestors created offspring, they were essentially running a massive genetic experiment, testing new combinations of traits against the challenges of their environment. Some combinations would be less successful, but others would be better adapted, more resistant to disease, more capable of survival. It was like nature's own research and development program, running millions of experiments simultaneously across geological time. The mathematical beauty of sexual reproduction becomes clear when you consider the numbers involved. If your ancestor had, say, 1,000 different genes, a sexual reproduction could only create one possible combination. But sexual reproduction, through the random assortment of chromosomes and genetic recombination, could create more possible combinations than there are atoms in the observable universe. Your ancestors had invented a system for generating practically infinite genetic diversity from a finite set of building blocks. And here you are, the living embodiment of this ancient strategy. Your immune system, one of the most sophisticated defensive networks ever evolved, is built on the principle of genetic diversity that your ancestors discovered 1.5 billion years ago. The reason you can resist diseases that might devastate other species, the reason you can adapt to new environments and challenges, all of it traces back to this fundamental decision to choose risk over safety, diversity over uniformity, innovation over repetition. Your body carries within it genetic combinations that have never existed before and will never exist again in exactly the same form. You are quite literally a unique genetic experiment, a novel solution to the challenges of existence, a one-time only combination of your ancestors' accumulated wisdom. The very cells that are keeping you alive as you sleep tonight are using defense, mechanisms that were first tested and refined through sexual reproduction over 1 billion years ago. The Red Queen hypothesis, named after the character in Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, who had to keep running just to stay in place, perfectly captures what your ancestors discovered. In the constantly changing landscape of biological warfare between organisms and their parasites, staying genetically static meant falling behind. Sexual reproduction allowed your ancestors to keep running, to keep evolving, to keep adapting at a pace that could match or exceed their microscopic enemies. Think about the profound commitment this represented. Your ancestors were choosing to never be satisfied with perfection, never to rest in the comfort of a successful genetic formula. Every generation was a new experiment, a new bet on the future, a new willingness to risk everything for the possibility of something better. They were like cosmic artists who refused to paint the same painter twice, each generation a new masterpiece, exploring new combinations of color and form. As the vast eons continued their slow progression, this fundamental insight would drive increasingly sophisticated innovations in sexual reproduction. Your ancestors would develop more efficient ways to generate genetic diversity, more elegant mechanisms for combining beneficial traits, more beautiful forms of the dance between risk and reward that defines sexual reproduction. But it all began with this simple recognition that in a changing world, perfection is the enemy of survival, and the greatest safety lies in embracing the beautiful uncertainty of genetic innovation. The gamble was paying off, and your ancestors were learning to play the cosmic game with increasing skill and sophistication. The next chapter of their story would take them into the realm of multicellular complexity, where sexual reproduction would become not just a survival strategy, but the foundation for entirely new forms of beauty, cooperation, and love. 1 billion years ago, as the vast symphony of evolution entered a new movement, your ancestors achieved something that would have seemed miraculous to their single-celled predecessors. They learned how to be many while remaining one, how to coordinate the sexual dance, not just between individual cells, but between entire communities of cells working together as unified organisms. They invented multicellular sex, and with it, opened the door to forms of reproduction so beautiful and complex that they would eventually give rise to every flower that ever bloomed, every song that ever attracted a mate, every moment of tenderness between lovers throughout the history of life. Picture this extraordinary transformation unfolding across the eons like a slow-motion symphony of cooperation. Your ancestors, having mastered the art of single-cell sexual reproduction, began to experiment with remaining together after reproduction, forming small colonies of genetically identical cells that could work together as a team. These early multicellular pioneers were like cellular orchestras, each individual cell playing its part in a larger composition. But the true genius emerged when these multicellular ancestors discovered how to specialize some of their cells exclusively for reproduction. Instead of every cell being capable of sexual reproduction, as had been the case for billions of years, some cells would sacrifice their own reproductive potential to support specialized reproductive cells. It was like a cellular society where some members became dedicated to ensuring the continuation of the entire community's genetic legacy. The beauty of this arrangement was profound. The somatic cells, as we call them, the cells that would never reproduce themselves, could focus entirely on keeping the organism alive, healthy, and competitive. Meanwhile, the germ cells, the reproductive specialists, could devote all their energy to perfecting the ancient dance of meiosis and sexual fusion. It was a division of labor so elegant that it transformed reproduction from a simple cellular process into an orchestrated performance involving potentially trillions of cooperating cells. Your multicellular ancestors were also experimenting with one of the most significant innovations in sexual reproduction, the development of distinct sexes. Instead of every individual being capable of both producing and receiving gametes, some organisms began specializing as producers of small, mobile gametes, while others became producers of large, resource-rich gametes. This was the birth of male and female as biological categories, a specialization that would transform sexual reproduction into an intricate dance of complementary roles. The logic behind this innovation was as beautiful as it was practical. Small, mobile gametes could be produced in vast numbers and could actively seek out partners, like cosmic messengers carrying genetic information across the ancient seas. Large, resource-rich gametes could provide the nutrients and cellular machinery needed to support early development, like carefully stocked libraries providing everything a new life would need to begin its journey. Together, they formed a perfect partnership, each sex contributing different but equally essential components to the reproductive process. And here you are, the direct descendant of these pioneering multicellular lovers, carrying within your body the living legacy of their innovations. Every cell in your body exists in either a somatic or germ line, a distinction your ancestors invented 1 billion years ago. Your reproductive organs are direct descendants of those first specialized reproductive tissues, still using the same basic principles of gamete production that your multicellular ancestors developed in the ancient seas. The profound intimacy of multicellular reproduction extends far beyond mechanical processes of gamete production and fertilization. Your ancestors were also developing the first forms of reproductive behavior, primitive courtship rituals that ensured their gametes would find each other in the vast oceans. They were learning to coordinate their reproductive timing, to release their gametes simultaneously, to create the conditions most favorable for successful fertilization. Think about how this connects to your own experience of attraction and desire. The neurochemical cascades that create feelings of romantic love, the hormonal cycles that regulate reproduction, the behavioral patterns that bring potential partners together, all of these evolved from the simple chemical signaling systems your multicellular ancestors used to coordinate their reproductive activities 1 billion years ago. Your ancestors were also discovering something that would become central to all future sexual reproduction: the importance of parental investment. The large, resource-rich gametes represented the first form of parental care, the first investment in the future success of offspring. This innovation would eventually lead to increasingly sophisticated forms of nurturing, from simple protective behaviors to the complex emotional bonds that characterize mammalian family relationships. As millions upon millions of years drifted past like peaceful dreams, your multicellular ancestors refined and elaborated these reproductive innovations. They developed more efficient ways to produce and deliver gametes, more sophisticated systems for recognizing compatible partners, more effective strategies for ensuring the survival of their offspring. They were writing the first chapters in the great book of sexual reproduction that would eventually include every form of courtship, every expression of parental love, every moment of reproductive success across the entire tree of life. The stage was now set for one of the most explosive periods of evolutionary innovation in the history of life. Your ancestors, having mastered the basics of multicellular sexual reproduction, were about to enter the Cambrian explosion, a period of such rapid diversification and innovation that it would transform life on Earth in ways that still influence every aspect of your existence today. The greatest evolutionary gamble was about to pay dividends beyond anything your ancestors could have imagined. 540 million years ago, the ancient oceans witnessed what can only be described as evolution's greatest celebration of sexual creativity. Your ancestors, having spent billions of years perfecting the art of reproduction, suddenly exploded into a carnival of biological innovation, so spectacular that scientists call it the Cambrian explosion. It was as if life itself had finally learned to dance with confidence, and the choreography was breathtaking. Picture the scene, if you will, as your ancestors transformed the seafloor into a living gallery of sexual artistry. In the space of just 25 million years, a mere blink of an eye in geological time, life invented an astonishing variety of body plans, reproductive strategies, and courtship displays. Your ancestors were like cosmic artists who had finally mastered their medium and were now creating masterpieces with abandon. The trilobites, those segmented pioneers who ruled the ancient seas, developed eyes sophisticated enough to spot potential mates across considerable distances. These compound eyes, with thousands of individual lenses, were like living kaleidoscopes that could detect the slightest movement, the most subtle color changes, the gentle undulations that might indicate a receptive partner swimming nearby. Your trilobite ancestors were conducting courtship rituals that involved visual displays we can only imagine, probably including synchronized swimming patterns, territorial displays, and elaborate dances performed on the ancient seafloor. The anomalocarids, those magnificent predators that grew to lengths of 6 feet or more, were experimenting with size-based sexual selection. The largest, most powerful individuals had the best access to mates, driving an evolutionary arms race that produced some of the most impressive animals ever to inhabit the early seas. Your ancestors were discovering that reproduction wasn't just about combining genes. It was about competing for the right to pass those genes to the next generation, a competition that would drive increasingly spectacular displays of strength, beauty, and skill. But perhaps most significantly, your Cambrian ancestors were perfecting the art of sexual recognition. In seas teeming with hundreds of different species, each with its own reproductive requirements, the ability to identify compatible partners became crucial. They developed sophisticated chemical communication systems, pheromones that could travel for miles through the water, carrying messages of sexual availability, genetic compatibility, and reproductive timing. The beauty of these ancient communication systems lies in their incredible specificity. Each species developed its own unique chemical signature, its own molecular love song that could be detected only by members of the same species. It was like a vast undersea internet of reproductive information, with countless channels of communication operating simultaneously without interference. Your ancestors were learning to speak the language of desire with unprecedented precision and sophistication. Your own ability to recognize and feel attracted to members of your own species traces directly back to these Cambrian innovations. The neurochemical pathways that process pheromones, the brain regions that evaluate potential partners, the hormonal cascades that create feelings of attraction. All of these evolved from the mate recognition systems your ancestors developed during the Cambrian explosion. When you catch a scent that somehow reminds you of someone you love, when you feel an inexplicable sense of chemistry with another person, you're experiencing echoes of communication systems that were perfected in ancient seas 540 million years ago. The Cambrian ancestors were also pioneering increasingly sophisticated forms of internal fertilization. Instead of simply releasing gametes into the water and hoping for the best, some species began developing ways to transfer sperm directly from males to females, ensuring much higher rates of fertilization success. This innovation required new levels of coordination between partners, more complex mating behaviors, and more intimate physical contact than had ever existed before in the history of life. Think about the profound trust this represented. Internal fertilization required individuals to come close enough to touch, to be vulnerable to each other, to coordinate their movements in precise synchrony. Your ancestors were learning that successful reproduction often required not just genetic compatibility, but behavioral cooperation, mutual trust, and what can only be described as the earliest forms of sexual intimacy. These Cambrian innovations in sexual reproduction had effects that rippled far beyond reproduction itself. The need to compete for mates drove the evolution of more sophisticated sensory systems, more complex nervous systems, more agile locomotion, more elaborate body ornamentation. Sexual selection became one of the primary drivers of evolutionary innovation, pushing your ancestors to develop capabilities they never would have needed for simple survival alone. The fossil record from this period reads like a catalog of sexual experimentation. Every major body plan that exists today was being tested, refined, and elaborated during the Cambrian explosion. Your ancestors were trying out every possible approach to the challenge of finding, attracting, and successfully mating with compatible partners in an increasingly complex biological landscape. As this extraordinary period of innovation continued across millions of years, your ancestors established the fundamental patterns of sexual reproduction that would influence all subsequent evolution. They proved that sexual reproduction wasn't just a survival strategy. It was a creative force that could drive the development of beauty, complexity, and diversity beyond anything the world had ever seen. The ancient seas were no longer just a place where life existed. They had become a theater where life performed its most elaborate productions, a stage where the cosmic gamble of sexual reproduction was paying dividends in forms of beauty and complexity that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations. Your ancestors had transformed reproduction from a simple cellular process into one of the most creative forces in the universe, and they were just getting started. 500 million years ago, as your ancestors gracefully transitioned from the explosive creativity of the Cambrian period into the more refined elegance of established marine ecosystems, they achieved innovations in sexual reproduction that would influence every aspect of your own romantic and reproductive life. The fish, those pioneering vertebrates who would eventually give rise to your entire lineage, were transforming the ancient seas into theaters of aquatic courtship so sophisticated and beautiful that they established behavioral patterns still visible in human relationships today. Picture your Piscean ancestors navigating the clear, warm seas of the early Paleozoic era, their streamlined bodies perfectly adapted for both survival and seduction. These early fish were the first of your ancestors to develop what we might recognize as genuine courtship behaviors, elaborate rituals of attraction that went far beyond the simple chemical signaling of their invertebrate predecessors. They were learning to dance underwater, creating choreographies of desire that combined movement, color, sound, and timing in ways that transformed reproduction into performance art. Your fish ancestors pioneered the concept of the breeding territory, staking out prime locations on the seafloor and defending them against rivals with displays of strength and determination that were both functional and beautiful. The males would often establish these territories weeks before the females were ready to spawn, spending enormous amounts of energy maintaining and improving their chosen spots, arranging the substrate, cleaning away debris, creating the perfect environment for reproduction and early development. The courtship displays themselves were marvels of evolutionary creativity. Males would perform elaborate swimming patterns, spiraling through the water in complex helixes, their fins spread wide, their colors intensified to maximum brilliance. They were like underwater fireworks, living kaleidoscopes that combined movement and color in patterns specifically designed to capture and hold female attention. Your ancestors were discovering that reproduction was not just about genetic compatibility, but about the ability to demonstrate fitness, creativity, and dedication through elaborate displays of skill and beauty. The spawning process that your fish ancestors developed was a masterpiece of synchronized reproduction. After days or weeks of courtship, pairs would come together in perfectly choreographed releases of gametes, the females releasing thousands of eggs just as the males released clouds of sperm, creating underwater galaxies of reproductive potential. The timing had to be precise, the coordination perfect, the trust absolute. Your ancestors were learning that successful reproduction required not just individual fitness, but the ability to work together as reproductive partners. But perhaps most significantly, your fish ancestors were experimenting with parental care in ways that would fundamentally influence all subsequent vertebrate reproduction. Instead of simply releasing gametes and hoping for the best, many species began guarding their eggs, fanning them with their fins to provide fresh water and oxygen, defending them against predators, and even carrying them in their mouths for protection. This was the beginning of parental investment as a reproductive strategy, the first tentative steps toward the complex emotional bonds between parents and offspring that would eventually culminate in human family relationships. And here you are, the direct descendant of these aquatic romantics, carrying within your body and behavior the living legacy of their innovations. Your own patterns of courtship, the way you establish and defend personal relationships, the way you demonstrate commitment and attractiveness to potential partners. All of these behaviors evolved from the territorial and display behaviors your fish ancestors perfected in the ancient seas. Your reproductive biology still follows the same basic patterns they established. The hormonal cascades that regulate your reproductive cycles, the neurochemical pathways that create feelings of sexual attraction, the physical mechanisms of gamete production and fertilization. All of these systems were first developed by your fish ancestors 500 million years ago. When you feel the excitement of new attraction, when you experience the satisfaction of successful courtship, when you feel protective instincts toward offspring, you're experiencing emotions that were first felt in the ancient oceans by your Piscean ancestors. The external fertilization strategies your fish ancestors used also taught them valuable lessons about the importance of environmental conditions for reproductive success. They learned to coordinate their spawning with seasonal changes, tidal cycles, and lunar phases, developing biological clocks that could track the passage of time with extraordinary precision. These timing mechanisms evolved into the complex hormonal cycles that still regulate reproduction in all vertebrates, including humans. Your fish ancestors were also the first to develop what we might call reproductive lifestyles, different approaches to the balance between current reproduction and future reproductive potential. Some species invested heavily in a single massive spawning event, producing thousands of offspring in one reproductive episode. Others spread their reproductive effort across multiple smaller spawning events, essentially betting on consistency over intensity. These strategies established the fundamental trade-offs between reproductive effort and survival that still influence human reproductive decisions today. As millions of years passed like gentle currents carrying your ancestors through time, their aquatic reproductive innovations became increasingly sophisticated. They developed more precise mate recognition systems, more efficient territorial behaviors, more effective parental care strategies, and more beautiful courtship displays. They were perfecting the art of underwater romance, creating a foundation of reproductive sophistication that would serve their descendants well as they prepared for the next great adventure in the evolution of sex. The stage was being set for one of the most significant transitions in the history of life. Some of your fish ancestors were about to leave the water entirely, taking their hard-won reproductive wisdom onto dry land and adapting it to the entirely new challenges of terrestrial reproduction. The gamble of sexual reproduction was about to enter a whole new phase, with innovations that would eventually make possible every form of terrestrial life, including your own existence. 365 million years ago, your ancestors embarked on one of the most romantic adventures in evolutionary history. They were about to take the ancient art of sexual reproduction, perfected over billions of years in the gentle embrace of water, and adapt it to the harsh, unforgiving world of dry land. These pioneering amphibians, your direct ancestors, were essentially cosmic immigrants, carrying with them the reproductive wisdom of the seas while learning entirely new ways to find love on land. Picture your amphibian ancestor, still glistening with the memory of ancient oceans, as it crawled up onto the muddy shores of a Devonian landscape unlike anything that exists today. This brave pioneer carried within its body all the reproductive sophistication of its aquatic ancestors, but now faced an entirely new challenge. How do you maintain the delicate dance of sexual reproduction in a world without the supporting medium of water? Your amphibian ancestors developed one of the most romantic solutions imaginable. They refused to abandon the aquatic embrace entirely, instead creating a lifestyle that honored both their aquatic heritage and their terrestrial aspirations. They became creatures of two worlds, spending their adult lives exploring the possibilities of land while returning to water for the most intimate moments of their lives, the sacred acts of courtship and reproduction. The courtship rituals your amphibian ancestors developed were symphonies of sound and movement that transformed quiet ponds and streams into concert halls of desire. For the first time in the history of life, your ancestors learned to sing. The male frogs and salamanders developed vocal abilities that could carry their romantic intentions across considerable distances, each species creating its own unique acoustic signature, its own love song that could cut through the chaos of the primeval landscape. These vocalizations were marvels of acoustic engineering. Your ancestors learned to modulate frequency, rhythm, and intensity to convey incredibly sophisticated information about their fitness, their location, their species identity, and their readiness to mate. They were like biological radio stations, each broadcasting on its own frequency, creating a complex soundscape of reproductive communication that filled the ancient nights with music. But the true genius of amphibian reproduction lay in their approach to the vulnerability problem. Sexual reproduction requires intimate contact, moments of defenselessness that can be dangerous in a world full of predators. Your amphibian ancestors developed a beautiful solution called amplexus, an embrace so tender and protective that it transformed the act of reproduction into a form of mutual guardianship. During amplexus, the male would embrace the female from behind, his arms wrapped around her body in a grip that could last for hours or even days. This wasn't simply a mating position, it was a partnership, a way of staying together through the vulnerable period of egg-laying and fertilization. The male would fertilize the eggs as the female released them, but more importantly, he would protect her during this defenseless time, using his body as a shield against potential threats. The spawning process itself was a ceremony of trust and coordination that would have been impossible without millions of years of evolutionary refinement. Pairs would venture together into carefully chosen aquatic environments, often returning to the same pools where they themselves had been born. The female would release hundreds or thousands of eggs in carefully timed pulses, while the male simultaneously released sperm, creating underwater clouds of reproductive potential that sparkled like living constellations in the ancient waters. Your amphibian ancestors were also pioneering more sophisticated forms of parental care. Some species began wrapping their eggs in protective foam, creating floating nurseries that provided both protection and optimal developmental conditions. Others developed elaborate nest-building behaviors, excavating depressions in mud or sand, arranging vegetation to create protective barriers, even standing guard over their developing offspring for weeks or months. And here you are, the direct beneficiary of these amphibian innovations in terrestrial reproduction. Your own reproductive biology still relies on many of the systems your amphibian ancestors developed. The hormonal cascades that regulate your reproductive cycles evolved from the seasonal breeding patterns they established. Your ability to recognize and respond to vocal communication, to interpret the subtle acoustic cues that indicate attraction or availability. All of this traces back to the first amphibian love songs that echoed across Devonian landscapes 365 million years ago. Your emotional capacity for protective partnership, the neurochemical mechanisms that create bonds between reproductive partners, the instinctive behaviors that drive parental care and family formation, all of these evolved from the amplexus embraces and parental investments your amphibian ancestors pioneered. When you feel the desire to protect and nurture those you love, when you experience the profound satisfaction of successful partnership, you're feeling emotions that were first experienced in the ancient embrace of amplexus. The amphibian approach to reproduction also established one of the most important principles in vertebrate sexual behavior, the concept of reproductive migration. Your ancestors learned that successful reproduction often requires journey, pilgrimage, the willingness to travel considerable distances to find optimal conditions for raising offspring. This migratory instinct evolved into the complex territorial and social behaviors that still influence human reproductive patterns today. Your amphibian ancestors were also developing increasingly sophisticated chemical communication systems, pheromones that could convey detailed information about reproductive status, genetic compatibility, and individual identity. These chemical languages became the foundation for the unconscious olfactory communication that still influences human attraction and mate choice, the subtle scent-based information processing that occurs below the level of conscious awareness, but profoundly influences reproductive decisions. As the vast eons continued their slow progression, amphibian reproductive strategies became increasingly diverse and sophisticated. Some species developed direct development, eliminating the aquatic larval stage entirely and giving birth to miniature adults. Others experimented with live birth, internal development, and increasingly complex forms of parental care. They were preparing the foundation for the next great leap in reproductive evolution, the complete terrestrial reproduction that would be achieved by their reptilian descendants. The amphibian adventure in terrestrial reproduction proved that the ancient gamble of sexual reproduction was flexible enough to adapt to entirely new environments, creative enough to solve problems that had never existed before, and beautiful enough to transform even the harsh realities of terrestrial life into opportunities for intimacy, partnership, and love. Your ancestors had successfully carried the romantic wisdom of the seas onto dry land, and they were just beginning to explore its terrestrial possibilities. 320 million years ago, your reptilian ancestors achieved what might be considered the most romantic revolution in evolutionary history. They liberated sexual reproduction from its ancient dependency on water, transforming the terrestrial environment into a complete theater of reproductive possibility. For the first time since life began, your ancestors could conduct their most intimate relationships entirely on dry land, free from the need to return to aquatic environments for reproduction. The innovation that made this possible was one of the most elegant solutions ever devised by evolution, the amniotic egg. Picture your reptilian ancestor carrying within her body a perfect miniature ocean, a private aquatic environment custom designed for her developing offspring. This wasn't just an egg. It was a masterpiece of biological engineering, a complete life support system that recreated all the advantages of aquatic development while protecting the embryo from the harsh realities of terrestrial existence. Inside this remarkable structure, your ancestor created multiple chambers, each serving a specific function in supporting development. The amnion formed a water-filled chamber where the embryo could develop in aquatic comfort, floating in its own private sea. The allantois served as both a respiratory organ and a waste disposal system, efficiently managing the metabolic needs of the growing embryo. The chorion regulated gas exchange with the outside world, while the yolk sac provided all the nutrients needed for complete development. It was like a self-contained spacecraft, perfectly designed for the journey from conception to independent life. But the amniotic egg represented more than just a technical innovation. It was a complete transformation of reproductive strategy. For the first time in evolutionary history, your ancestors could invest enormous amounts of resources into individual offspring before birth, creating young that were far more developed, far more capable, far more likely to survive than anything that had come before. This was the beginning of what we might call quality over quantity reproductive strategies. Fewer offspring, but each one receiving much greater parental investment. The courtship behaviors your reptilian ancestors developed were correspondingly sophisticated. Released from the need to coordinate reproduction with specific aquatic environments, they could conduct their romantic relationships across the full diversity of terrestrial habitats. They developed elaborate territorial displays, complex dominance hierarchies, and increasingly sophisticated chemical and visual communication systems that allowed them to evaluate and choose partners with unprecedented precision. Your reptilian ancestors pioneered many of the reproductive behaviors that still characterize vertebrate sexuality today. They developed mate guarding, where males would remain close to females for extended periods to prevent other males from mating with them. They experimented with elaborate nuptial gifts, offering food or other resources to potential partners as demonstrations of their ability to provide for offspring. They created sophisticated nest-building behaviors, constructing elaborate structures specifically designed to optimize conditions for egg incubation and early development. The mating process itself became increasingly complex and intimate. Internal fertilization required new levels of physical coordination between partners, more sophisticated anatomical structures, and more elaborate behavioral synchronization. Your reptilian ancestors were developing what can only be described as the first true sexual intimacy in the modern sense. Physical and emotional connections that went far beyond the simple gamete release of their aquatic ancestors. And here you are, carrying within your body the direct legacy of these reptilian innovations. Your own reproductive system is built on the same basic plan your reptilian ancestors developed 320 million years ago. The hormones that regulate your reproductive cycles, the anatomical structures that make sexual reproduction possible, the neurochemical pathways that create feelings of sexual desire and romantic attachment, all of these evolved from the systems your reptilian ancestors pioneered. Your capacity for forming long-term reproductive partnerships, for investing heavily in individual offspring, for experiencing sexual pleasure as something more than just reproductive function. All of this traces back to the behavioral innovations your reptilian ancestors developed as they adapted sexual reproduction to fully terrestrial lifestyles. When you experience the profound satisfaction of intimate partnership, when you feel protective instincts toward offspring, when you make reproductive choices based on long-term considerations rather than immediate opportunities, you're using decision-making systems that were first developed by reptiles in the ancient forests of the Carboniferous period. The reptilian approach to reproduction also established the foundation for increasingly sophisticated forms of sexual selection. With internal fertilization and high parental investment, the choice of reproductive partner became increasingly important, driving the evolution of more elaborate courtship displays, more sophisticated mate evaluation systems, and more complex social structures built around reproductive relationships. Your reptilian ancestors were also experimenting with different reproductive timing strategies. Some species developed the ability to delay implantation or development, storing sperm or embryos until environmental conditions were optimal for reproduction. Others learned to coordinate reproduction with seasonal cycles, developing biological clocks that could track annual rhythms with extraordinary precision. These timing mechanisms evolved into the complex hormonal systems that still regulate human reproductive cycles and sexual behavior. Perhaps most significantly, your reptilian ancestors established the principle of reproductive privacy. With internal fertilization and terrestrial development, reproduction became something that could happen away from the crowded, competitive environments of aquatic spawning grounds. Pairs could find private locations, spend extended time together, and develop the kinds of intimate partnerships that form the foundation of all subsequent vertebrate family structures. As millions of years passed like slow, warm seasons in ancient landscapes, reptilian reproductive strategies became increasingly diverse and sophisticated. Some species developed live birth, eliminating the vulnerability of external eggs entirely. Others experimented with increasingly complex forms of parental care, temperature regulation, and social cooperation in reproduction. They were preparing the way for even more advanced forms of reproductive behavior, innovations that would be achieved by their warm-blooded descendants. The reptilian revolution in terrestrial reproduction proved that sexual reproduction was not just adaptable, but infinitely creative, capable of transforming every new environmental challenge into an opportunity for greater intimacy, more sophisticated partnership, and more beautiful expressions of the ancient dance between individual survival and genetic continuation. Your ancestors had successfully completed the transition from water to land, carrying with them all the reproductive wisdom of their aquatic heritage, while adding entirely new dimensions of terrestrial romantic possibility. 200 million years ago, as the great reptilian dynasties reached their magnificent peak, your ancestors achieved something that would forever change the nature of reproduction and parental love. They became warm-blooded, and with that transformation, they revolutionized not just how they lived, but how they loved, how they cared for their young, and how they formed the emotional bonds that would eventually evolve into the complex family relationships that characterize mammalian life today. Picture your early mammalian ancestor, small and probably nocturnal, moving through the shadows of a world dominated by dinosaurs. This tiny pioneer carried within its warm body a reproductive revolution that was as significant as any innovation in the history of sexual reproduction. For the first time, an animal could maintain constant body temperature independent of environmental conditions. And this simple change transformed every aspect of reproductive biology. The warm-blooded revolution meant that your mammalian ancestors could maintain optimal conditions for gamete production, regardless of external temperature. Their reproductive systems could function efficiently in cold environments, during harsh seasons, and throughout daily temperature fluctuations that would have shut down the reproductive capabilities of their cold-blooded predecessors. They had achieved reproductive independence from environmental temperature, opening up entirely new possibilities for when, where, and how reproduction could occur. But the true genius of mammalian reproduction lay in what happened after fertilization. Your ancestors developed the most sophisticated parental care system ever evolved, a combination of internal development, live birth, and extended postnatal nurturing that would transform reproduction from a relatively brief biological event into a long-term, emotional partnership between parents and offspring. The placenta, that remarkable organ your mammalian ancestors invented, was nothing short of a biological miracle. It created an intimate physiological connection between mother and developing offspring that went far beyond anything achieved by even the most sophisticated reptilian eggs. Through the placenta, your ancestor could share her bloodstream with her developing young, providing not just nutrients, but oxygen, antibodies, hormones, and even emotional states that would influence development in profound ways. This placental connection meant that for the first time in evolutionary history, the emotional and physiological state of the parent could directly influence the development of offspring before birth. Your mammalian ancestors were discovering that reproduction wasn't just about combining genes and providing nutrients. It was about sharing experiences, emotions, and even memories across generations in ways that had never been possible before. The birth process itself became an increasingly intimate and intense experience that required new levels of physiological and behavioral coordination. Unlike the relatively simple egg-laying of their reptilian ancestors, mammalian birth involved complex hormonal cascades, powerful muscular contractions, and neurochemical changes that created entirely new forms of emotional bonding between parents and offspring. But perhaps the most revolutionary innovation was lactation. Your mammalian ancestors developed the ability to continue nourishing their young after birth, creating an extended period of intimate physical and emotional connection that would fundamentally shape the brain, development, and social capabilities of their offspring. Lactation wasn't just about providing nutrition. It was about creating the neurochemical foundations for emotional attachment, social cooperation, and complex communication that would characterize all subsequent mammalian societies. The milk your mammalian ancestors produced was custom designed for their species-specific developmental needs, with precisely calibrated combinations of proteins, fats, sugars, antibodies, and even hormones that would optimize growth and development. But more than that, the act of nursing created regular opportunities for physical contact, chemical communication, and emotional bonding that established the foundation for all subsequent mammalian social behaviors. And here you are, the direct beneficiary of these mammalian innovations in reproductive care. Your own capacity for emotional attachment, the neurochemical systems that create bonds between romantic partners and between parents and children, the hormonal cascades that generate feelings of love, protection, and nurturing. All of these evolved from the lactation and extended parental care systems your mammalian ancestors developed 200 million years ago. Your human reproductive system still follows the same basic patterns they established. The hormonal cycles that regulate your fertility, the physiological changes that occur during pregnancy, the neurochemical responses that create romantic and parental love, the behavioral patterns that drive mate selection and family formation. All of these are elaborations of systems your mammalian ancestors pioneered in the shadow of the dinosaurs. The extended childhood that mammals pioneered also transformed the nature of reproductive investment. Your ancestors were learning that reproductive success wasn't just about producing viable offspring. It was about producing offspring capable of complex learning, social cooperation, and cultural transmission. They were investing more time and energy in fewer offspring, but those offspring were capable of achieving things that would have been impossible for their more numerous but less intensively cared for reptilian cousins. Your mammalian ancestors were also developing increasingly sophisticated social structures built around reproductive relationships. Pair bonding, cooperative child-rearing, extended family groups, and complex social hierarchies all evolved from the intensive parental care requirements of mammalian reproduction. They were discovering that successful reproduction often required not just individual effort, but social cooperation, community support, and cultural knowledge passed down across generations. The mammalian approach to reproduction also established new forms of sexual selection, based on parental care capabilities rather than just physical prowess or genetic quality. Partners began choosing each other based on their ability to provide extended care, protection, and resources for offspring. This drove the evolution of increasingly sophisticated behavioral displays, more complex mate evaluation systems, and deeper emotional connections between reproductive partners. As the vast epochs continued their slow progression, mammalian reproductive strategies became increasingly diverse and sophisticated. Some species developed seasonal breeding patterns synchronized with optimal environmental conditions. Others evolved continuous fertility cycles that allowed reproduction throughout the year. Still others experimented with cooperative breeding systems where extended family groups shared the responsibilities of child rearing. The mammalian revolution in reproductive care proved that the ancient gamble of sexual reproduction could be transformed into something far more complex and beautiful than simple genetic combination. Your ancestors had discovered that reproduction could be the foundation for emotional bonding, social cooperation, cultural transmission, and forms of love that connected not just individuals, but entire communities across generations. They had transformed reproduction from a biological necessity into a social institution, laying the groundwork for all the complex family structures and emotional relationships that would eventually characterize human societies. Between 230 and 65 million years ago, while your small mammalian ancestors were quietly revolutionizing parental care in the shadows, the dominant reptiles of their time were conducting their own spectacular experiments in sexual reproduction. These dinosaurs, the magnificent rulers of the Mesozoic world, were your ancestors too, through the evolutionary line that would eventually lead to birds, and their courtship innovations were so beautiful and sophisticated that they established behavioral patterns, still visible in both avian and human relationships today. Picture the ancient landscapes of the Mesozoic era, where your dinosaurian cousins transformed the art of sexual display into performances of such grandeur that they rivaled the most elaborate human cultural productions. These were not the lumbering, dim-witted creatures of popular imagination, but sophisticated animals with complex nervous systems, elaborate social structures, and reproductive behaviors that combined visual spectacle, acoustic communication, and architectural artistry in ways that had never been seen before in the history of life. Your theropod dinosaur relatives, the ancestors of modern birds, were pioneering feathered displays that turned courtship into living art. Males would grow elaborate plumage specifically for breeding season, creating patterns and colors of such intricate beauty that they transformed their bodies into walking galleries of evolutionary aesthetics. These weren't just random arrangements of color and pattern. They were carefully organized visual compositions designed to demonstrate genetic quality, health, and fitness to discriminating female partners. The courtship dances these dinosaurs performed were choreographic marvels that combined precise movements with acoustic displays and visual presentations. Males would clear elaborate courting grounds, arrange decorative materials in specific patterns, and perform complex sequences of movements that showcase their strength, coordination, and artistic sensibilities. They were like prehistoric choreographers, each species developing its own signature style, its own traditional movements passed down and refined across millions of years. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of dinosaur courtship was the construction of elaborate nests and nesting colonies. Your dinosaurian relatives were among the first animals to create architectural structures specifically designed for reproduction, building mounds, excavating chambers, and arranging materials in complex patterns that provided optimal conditions for incubation, while also serving as impressive displays of construction skill and resource-gathering ability. Some of the larger dinosaurs created communal nesting grounds that functioned like prehistoric cities, with hundreds of individuals cooperating in site selection, construction, and defense. These nesting colonies required sophisticated social coordination, communication systems, and cooperative behaviors that provided the evolutionary foundation for the complex social structures that would later characterize both bird and mammalian societies, including human communities. The parental care behaviors your dinosaurian relatives developed were remarkably sophisticated. Many species showed clear evidence of extended parental investment, including nest guarding, temperature regulation through brooding behaviors, and even feeding of young after hatching. Some dinosaurs developed the ability to regulate nest temperature by covering and uncovering eggs, essentially functioning as biological thermostats to ensure optimal developmental conditions. The vocalizations dinosaurs used for communication during courtship and reproduction were probably far more complex and varied than we can reconstruct from fossil evidence. Based on their living bird descendants, your dinosaurian relatives likely developed sophisticated acoustic communication systems that could convey detailed information about individual identity, fitness, emotional state, and reproductive intentions across considerable distances. And here you are, carrying within your behavior and biology the living legacy of these ancient reproductive innovations. Your own capacity for elaborate courtship displays, for creating and appreciating art as a form of sexual attraction, for coordinating complex social behaviors around reproductive activities. All of these trace back to the behavioral innovations your dinosaurian relatives pioneered during the Mesozoic era. Your human tendency to create and maintain elaborate living spaces, to use architecture and decoration as expressions of personal fitness and attractiveness, to coordinate large-scale social events around reproductive celebrations like weddings. All of these behaviors evolved from the nest-building and colonial reproductive behaviors your dinosaurian cousins developed over 100 million years ago. The dinosaurian emphasis on visual display and aesthetic appreciation during courtship established neurological pathways that would eventually evolve into human capacities for artistic creation and aesthetic judgment. When you feel moved by beautiful visual compositions, when you appreciate symmetry and color in ways that seem to transcend simple survival needs, when you create art as a form of personal expression and social communication, you're using cognitive systems that first evolved to evaluate and create sexual displays in dinosaur courtship rituals. The acoustic communication systems dinosaurs developed also contributed to the evolution of complex vocalization abilities that would eventually give rise to bird songs, mammalian calls, and ultimately human speech and music. Your capacity to communicate emotional states through vocal variations, to coordinate social activities through acoustic signals, to appreciate and create complex acoustic patterns, all of these abilities trace back to the vocal innovations of your dinosaurian relatives. The cooperative behaviors required for successful colonial nesting also established social coordination, abilities that would prove crucial for the evolution of complex mammalian and primate societies. Your human capacity for large-scale social cooperation, for coordinating group activities around shared goals, for creating and maintaining social institutions that support reproductive success, all of these evolved from the colonial reproductive behaviors dinosaurs pioneered in the Mesozoic era. As those 65 million years of dinosaur dominance drew to their dramatic close, the reproductive innovations they had developed didn't disappear with the mass extinction. Instead, they lived on through their bird descendants and influenced the evolutionary trajectory of the mammalian lineages that would eventually lead to your own species. The dinosaur legacy of elaborate courtship, sophisticated parental care, complex social coordination, and aesthetic appreciation became part of the evolutionary inheritance that would shape all subsequent vertebrate reproduction, including the remarkably complex sexual and social behaviors that characterize human relationships today. The dinosaur chapter in the story of sexual reproduction proved that given sufficient time and evolutionary pressure, sexual selection could drive the development of behaviors and capabilities that went far beyond simple survival requirements, creating forms of beauty, artistry, and social coordination that transformed reproduction into one of the most creative and sophisticated forces in the natural world. 55 million years ago, as the age of dinosaurs gave way to the age of mammals. Your primate ancestors began developing innovations in sexual reproduction that would fundamentally reshape the relationship between sex, society, and intelligence. These early primates, swinging through the canopies of ancient forests, were transforming sexual reproduction from a primarily biological process into something far more complex. A social institution that would become the foundation for increasingly sophisticated forms of cooperation, communication, and cultural transmission. Picture your early primate ancestor, perhaps something like a small lemur, navigating the three-dimensional world of the forest canopy. Life in the trees required unprecedented levels of social coordination, spatial reasoning, and cooperative behavior. Your ancestors couldn't survive as solitary individuals in this complex arboreal environment. They needed to form social groups, coordinate their movements, share information about food sources and predators, and develop increasingly sophisticated systems of communication and cooperation. Sexual reproduction became the organizing principle around which these early primate societies developed. Unlike their more solitary mammalian relatives, your primate ancestors discovered that successful reproduction required not just finding a mate and producing offspring, but integrating those activities into complex social networks that could provide protection, resources, and cooperative childcare across extended periods. Your primate ancestors were pioneering what we might call social sexuality, reproductive behaviors that served multiple functions beyond simple procreation. Sexual activity became a form of social bonding, a way of establishing and maintaining relationships within the group, a mechanism for resolving conflicts and reducing tension, and a form of communication that could convey complex information about social status, alliances, and intentions. The extended childhood that characterized primate development meant that successful reproduction required long-term social support from not just parents, but entire communities. Your primate ancestors were learning that raising intelligent, socially sophisticated offspring required resources and expertise that no individual parent could provide alone. They developed cooperative child-rearing systems where multiple adults contributed to the care and education of young, creating the first educational institutions in the biological world. This cooperative approach to reproduction and child-rearing drove the evolution of increasingly sophisticated cognitive abilities. Your primate ancestors needed to track complex social relationships, remember individual personalities and behavioral patterns, anticipate the needs and reactions of other group members, and coordinate their own reproductive activities with the broader social dynamics of their communities. These cognitive demands drove the evolution of larger, more complex brains capable of social reasoning at unprecedented levels. The communication systems your primate ancestors developed were remarkably sophisticated, combining vocalizations, facial expressions, body language, and even primitive forms of gestural communication. They were learning to convey complex emotional and social information through multiple channels simultaneously, creating rich, nuanced systems of social communication that could coordinate group activities, resolve conflicts, and facilitate the complex negotiations required for successful cooperative reproduction. Your primate ancestors were also developing increasingly sophisticated mate choice criteria that went beyond simple physical fitness to include social skills, intelligence, and cooperative abilities. Partners were chosen not just for their genetic quality, but for their ability to contribute to the complex social and cooperative activities required for successful child rearing. This drove sexual selection toward increasing intelligence, social sophistication, and cooperative capabilities. And here you are, the direct beneficiary of these primate innovations in social sexuality. Your human capacity for forming complex social relationships, for using sexual activity as a form of social bonding and communication, for coordinating reproductive activities within elaborate social institutions like marriage and family structures, All of these evolved from the social reproductive systems your primate ancestors developed in the ancient forest canopies. Your remarkable human ability to maintain long-term romantic partnerships, to feel emotional bonds that persist far beyond the immediate demands of reproduction, to experience sexual pleasure as something that enhances social and emotional connection rather than just serving reproductive function. All of this traces back to the social bonding innovations your primate ancestors pioneered 55 million years ago. The cooperative child-rearing systems humans have developed, from extended families to complex educational institutions, all evolved from the cooperative parenting behaviors your primate ancestors established. Your capacity to learn from multiple teachers, to benefit from the accumulated knowledge and experience of entire communities, to participate in cultural transmission across generations, all of this grew out of the cooperative childcare systems that first evolved in primate societies. Your human social intelligence, your ability to navigate complex social relationships, to understand and predict the behavior of other individuals, to coordinate your activities with multiple partners and groups simultaneously. All of these cognitive abilities evolved from the social coordination requirements of primate reproductive systems. The communication abilities that allow humans to discuss abstract concepts, to share complex emotional states, to coordinate elaborate social activities, and to transmit cultural knowledge across generations. All of these evolved from the sophisticated communication systems your primate ancestors developed to coordinate their social reproductive activities. As millions of years passed like long, peaceful seasons in ancient forests, primate social and reproductive systems became increasingly sophisticated. Different lineages experimented with different social structures, from monogamous pairs to complex multi-male, multi-female groups to elaborate dominance hierarchies. They developed increasingly complex systems of alliance formation, conflict resolution, and cooperative resource sharing, all organized around the fundamental challenge of successfully reproducing and raising intelligent, socially capable offspring. The primate revolution in social sexuality proved that sexual reproduction could be transformed into something far more complex and meaningful than simple genetic combination. Your ancestors had discovered that reproduction could be the foundation for intelligence, social cooperation, cultural development, and forms of emotional connection that would eventually give rise to the complex romantic and family relationships that characterize human societies today. They had begun the transformation of sexual reproduction from a biological process into a cultural institution, setting the stage for the final chapters in this remarkable evolutionary story. 7 million years ago, in the ancient landscapes of Africa, your hominin ancestors began making reproductive choices that would fundamentally distinguish them from all other primates and set the stage for the emergence of uniquely human forms of sexuality and romantic love. These early hominins, walking upright across the savannas where forests had once stood, were developing reproductive innovations so significant that they would eventually transform not just how humans mate and reproduce, but how they think, feel, and organize their entire social existence. The most revolutionary change your hominin ancestors made was the concealment of ovulation. Unlike virtually all other mammals, where females advertise their fertile periods through obvious physical and behavioral signals, your ancestors evolved what scientists call hidden estrus. Female hominins stopped showing visible signs of ovulation, creating a situation where neither males nor females could precisely predict when conception was most likely to occur. Picture the profound implications of this seemingly simple change. For millions of years, your primate ancestors had organized their social and sexual lives around the clearly advertised fertility cycles of females. Males competed intensely during obvious fertile periods, then largely ignored females during non-fertile times. Females could precisely time sexual activity to coincide with their reproductive goals. The concealment of ovulation changed everything about this ancient system. With hidden ovulation, Your hominin ancestors were essentially transforming sexual activity from a primarily reproductive function into something far more complex and socially significant. Sexual activity could now occur at any time, divorced from the immediate goal of conception, opening up entirely new possibilities for using sex as a form of social bonding, emotional communication, and relationship maintenance. This change encouraged the formation of longer-term pair bonds between males and females. Since males could no longer predict when females were fertile, the most successful reproductive strategy became forming extended partnerships and maintaining ongoing sexual relationships throughout the entire cycle. Your ancestors were moving away from the intense but brief competitive mating systems of their primate relatives toward something much more resembling modern human romantic relationships. The hidden ovulation innovation also transformed the nature of female reproductive choice. Without obvious fertile periods to attract male attention, females gained much greater control over sexual activity and partner selection. They could initiate or decline sexual interactions based on their evaluation of potential partners, rather than being subject to intense male competition during fertile periods. This shift in sexual autonomy drove the evolution of more sophisticated mate choice criteria and more complex courtship behaviors. Your hominin ancestors were also developing increasingly sophisticated cultural practices around reproduction and sexuality. With sexual activity disconnected from obvious fertility cues, they began creating social institutions and cultural practices to regulate and organize sexual relationships. These were the earliest forms of what would eventually evolve into marriage customs, family structures, and the complex social rules that govern human reproductive behavior. The pair bonding systems your hominin ancestors developed were unlike anything seen in other primates. These weren't just temporary partnerships for reproduction. They were extended emotional and social relationships that could persist for years or even entire lifespans. Your ancestors were learning to form romantic attachments based on personality compatibility, shared experiences, mutual support, and emotional connection, rather than just physical attraction and reproductive timing. This transformation of sexual relationships into emotional partnerships drove the evolution of new neurochemical systems for romantic bonding. Your hominin ancestors developed the capacity for what we now recognize as romantic love, complex emotional states that combine sexual attraction with deep emotional attachment, protective instincts, and long-term commitment. These feelings serve to maintain pair bonds even during periods when reproduction wasn't possible or desired. And here you are, the direct beneficiary of these hominin innovations in romantic partnership. Your human capacity to form deep, lasting romantic attachments that persist independent of immediate reproductive goals, to experience sexual pleasure as an expression of emotional connection rather than just biological function, to maintain intimate relationships based on personality compatibility and shared emotional experiences. All of this evolved from the hidden ovulation and pair bonding systems your hominin ancestors developed 7 million years ago. Your modern human reproductive systems still follow the patterns they established. The concealed ovulation that characterizes human females, the extended periods of sexual receptivity that allow year-round reproductive activity, the complex hormonal and neurochemical systems that create and maintain romantic attachments, the social institutions like marriage that formalize long-term reproductive partnerships. All of these are direct descendants of hominin innovations. The cultural regulation of sexuality that characterizes all human societies also traces back to these early hominin developments. Your ancestors were the first animals to create social rules and cultural practices around sexual behavior, the first to develop complex courtship rituals, the first to integrate sexual relationships into broader social and economic systems. They were transforming reproduction from a biological process into a cultural institution. Your hominin ancestors were also developing increasingly sophisticated parental investment strategies. The extended childhood required for developing large, complex brains meant that successful reproduction required unprecedented levels of cooperative care from both parents and extended family networks. They were creating the first truly human family structures, with fathers playing active roles in childcare and extended relatives, contributing to the resources and knowledge needed for successful child development. As hundreds of thousands of years passed like long migrations across ancient landscapes, hominin reproductive systems became increasingly sophisticated. Different populations experimented with different forms of pair bonding, different approaches to parental care, different ways of integrating sexual relationships into social and economic systems. They were laying the foundation for the incredible diversity of human reproductive and romantic customs that would eventually spread across the entire globe. The hominin revolution in concealed ovulation and pair bonding proved that sexual reproduction could be transformed into something uniquely human, a complex integration of biological drives, emotional attachments, social institutions, and cultural practices that would become one of the defining characteristics of human nature itself. Your ancestors had begun the final transformation of the ancient evolutionary gamble of sexual reproduction into the sophisticated system of human romantic love and family formation that still shapes your life today. 300,000 years ago, your Homo sapiens ancestors completed the transformation of sexual reproduction that had begun millions of years earlier with the first tentative genetic exchanges between ancient bacteria. They developed reproductive behaviors and sexual capabilities so sophisticated, so uniquely human, that they transcended the purely biological functions of reproduction and became expressions of the highest human capacities for creativity, emotional connection, and cultural meaning. Your sapiens ancestors were the first animals to completely separate sexual pleasure from reproductive function, to engage in sexual activity primarily for emotional bonding, social communication, and pure physical pleasure rather than for conception. This wasn't just a behavioral change, it was a fundamental transformation in the very nature of sexuality itself. Your ancestors had discovered that the ancient biological drive for reproduction could be transformed into something far more complex and meaningful, a form of intimate communication that could express and strengthen the deepest human emotional connections. The sexual behaviors your sapiens ancestors developed were remarkably diverse and creative. They experimented with different positions, techniques, and practices that had nothing to do with reproductive efficiency and everything to do with mutual pleasure, emotional intimacy, and creative expression. They were essentially transforming sex into a form of art, a creative collaboration between partners that could be refined, varied, and personalized according to individual preferences and cultural traditions. Your ancestors also developed the capacity for what can only be called recreational sexuality, sexual activity engaged in purely for pleasure, bonding, and emotional satisfaction rather than for reproduction. This represented a complete revolution in sexual behavior, the first time in the history of life that animals regularly engaged in sexual activity with no reproductive intent or outcome. They were discovering that sexual pleasure was a valuable experience in its own right, worth pursuing for its own rewards, rather than just as a means to reproductive ends. The romantic relationships your sapiens ancestors formed were correspondingly sophisticated. They developed the capacity for passionate romantic love, intense emotional attachments that could persist for entire lifespans and inspire extraordinary acts of creativity, sacrifice, and devotion. These weren't just pair bonds for reproduction. They were profound emotional connections that gave meaning and purpose to entire lives. Your ancestors began creating art, music, poetry, and literature inspired by romantic love and sexual desire. They were the first animals to express their reproductive feelings through creative cultural productions, transforming sexual attraction into artistic inspiration. The cave paintings, musical instruments, and decorative objects your ancestors created often included explicit or symbolic representations of sexuality and reproduction, showing that these aspects of life had become deeply integrated into their cultural and spiritual understanding of existence. The cultural institutions your sapiens ancestors developed around sexuality and reproduction were remarkably elaborate. They created complex marriage customs, courtship rituals, and family structures that regulated and celebrated sexual relationships. These weren't just practical arrangements for organizing reproduction. They were sophisticated cultural systems that recognized sexual relationships as fundamental to human social organization and individual fulfillment. Your ancestors were also developing increasingly complex and diverse sexual identities. Unlike other animals, where sexual behavior is largely determined by biological drives and simple social structures, humans began creating individual sexual personalities, unique approaches to sexuality that reflected personal preferences, cultural influences, and individual psychological characteristics. They were discovering that sexuality could be a form of personal expression, a way of communicating individual identity and forming personalized, intimate connections. And here you are, the ultimate expression of this 300,000-year refinement of human sexuality. Your capacity to experience sexual pleasure as an end in itself, to form romantic attachments based on emotional compatibility and personal attraction, to use sexual expression as a form of intimate communication with chosen partners. All of this represents the culmination of the longest evolutionary experiment in the history of life. Your modern human sexuality incorporates every innovation your ancestors developed over billions of years, from the basic cellular mechanisms of genetic recombination to the sophisticated neurochemical systems that create romantic love, from the ancient drive for genetic diversity to the uniquely human capacity for recreational pleasure and emotional intimacy. You are literally the living embodiment of the greatest evolutionary gamble ever attempted, and its most successful outcome. Your ability to choose partners based on personal compatibility rather than just biological fitness, to maintain romantic relationships that enhance your emotional well-being rather than just serving reproductive functions, to experience sexual intimacy as a form of profound personal connection rather than just biological drive. All of this represents the transformation of the ancient reproductive gamble into something uniquely beautiful and human. The creative potential that human sexuality has unleashed continues to drive cultural evolution, artistic expression, and social innovation. Your ancestors' discovery that reproductive energy could be channeled into creative and cultural pursuits has led to countless works of art, literature, music, and cultural achievement inspired by romantic love and sexual desire. The same biological drives that once served only to perpetuate genetic material have become sources of the highest human cultural achievements. As we move through this modern era, human sexuality continues to evolve culturally, even as its biological foundations remain rooted in the ancient innovations of your evolutionary ancestors. The technologies, social institutions, and cultural practices that characterize contemporary human sexuality all represent elaborations of the basic pattern your sapiens ancestors established, the transformation of reproduction from a biological necessity into a realm of personal choice, creative expression, and profound emotional meaning. Your sapiens ancestors had successfully completed the greatest transformation in the history of sexual reproduction, proving that the ancient gamble of genetic mixing could be refined and elaborated until it became something far more beautiful, meaningful, and uniquely satisfying than its humble bacterial origins could ever have suggested. In our modern era, you have inherited the most sophisticated sexual and romantic capabilities ever evolved on Earth, the culmination of billions of years of evolutionary refinement and innovation. Your contemporary ancestors, the humans of the past few thousand years, have been conducting the most recent phase of the greatest reproductive experiment in biological history, using technology, culture, and conscious choice to further transform the ancient evolutionary gamble of sexual reproduction. Your recent ancestors developed technologies that have fundamentally altered human reproductive capabilities and choices. They learned to control fertility with unprecedented precision, separating sexual pleasure from reproduction more completely than ever before in evolutionary history. They created medical technologies that could overcome reproductive limitations, assist conception when natural processes failed, and ensure healthy development of offspring in ways that would have seemed miraculous to earlier generations. These technological innovations have given you reproductive choices that are unique in the history of life. You can engage in sexual relationships with complete control over reproductive outcomes, choosing exactly when and whether to reproduce based on personal desires, circumstances, and goals rather than biological drives alone. You represent the first generation of animals in the history of the planet to have such complete conscious control over the reproductive process. Your contemporary human ancestors have also used technology to transform sexual communication and partner selection in revolutionary ways. They created global communication networks that allow individuals to connect across vast distances, expanding the potential pool of romantic partners beyond anything possible in earlier human societies. They developed new forms of sexual and romantic expression through digital media, creating virtual forms of intimacy and connection that supplement and enhance physical relationships. The cultural evolution of human sexuality has accelerated dramatically in recent centuries. Your recent ancestors experimented with new forms of romantic relationships, family structures, and sexual identities, creating unprecedented diversity in human reproductive and romantic behavior. They developed more egalitarian approaches to sexual relationships, more accepting attitudes toward sexual diversity, and more sophisticated understanding of the psychological and emotional dimensions of human sexuality. Your modern human inheritance includes not just the biological capacity for sexual reproduction, but conscious understanding of the entire evolutionary history that led to your existence. You are the first animals in the history of life to understand your own reproductive biology, to consciously appreciate the evolutionary processes that created your sexual capabilities, and to make informed choices about reproduction based on scientific knowledge rather than just instinct. And here you are, lying peacefully in your comfortable bed, the temporary culmination of the greatest evolutionary success story ever written. Your very existence represents the successful outcome of billions of reproductive gambles, each one a bet placed by your ancestors on the value of genetic diversity, the power of sexual selection, and the possibilities inherent in combining genetic material from two different individuals. Every cell in your body carries the molecular machinery that your bacterial ancestors invented 3.5 billion years ago for exchanging genetic information. Your reproductive organs use the same basic mechanisms that your fish ancestors developed 500 million years ago for producing and combining gametes. Your capacity for romantic love uses neurochemical systems that evolved from the pair bonding innovations of your mammalian and primate ancestors. Your ability to experience sexual pleasure as an expression of emotional intimacy represents the ultimate refinement of systems that began with simple cellular recognition between compatible gametes in ancient seas. Your capacity to choose romantic partners based on personality compatibility, shared values, and emotional connection represents the most sophisticated mate selection system ever evolved. You are literally the answer to the greatest question ever posed by evolution. What happens when you take the simple biological drive for reproduction and refine it through billions of years of innovation, selection, and creative experimentation? The answer is you, a conscious being capable of understanding and appreciating the entire magnificent story that led to your existence. The reproductive choices you make, the relationships you form, the ways you express sexuality and romantic love, all of these represent the continuation of the greatest evolutionary experiment ever conducted. Your ancestors took the ultimate gamble when they abandoned the safety of asexual reproduction for the risky adventure of sexual genetic combination. And you are the living proof that their bet paid off beyond anything they could have imagined. As you rest tonight, your body quietly continuing the biological processes your ancestors perfected over geological time, you can take profound satisfaction in knowing that you represent the temporary culmination of the most successful experiment in the history of life itself. And so, dear fellow traveler through deep time, we arrive at the end of our journey through the greatest story ever told. The epic tale of how your ancestors transformed the simple biological necessity of reproduction into the complex, beautiful, meaningful expression of human sexuality and romantic love that enriches your life today. We've drifted together across 3.8 billion years of evolutionary innovation, witnessing each step in the magnificent gamble that led to your existence. Along the way, we've seen that sexual reproduction is not just a biological process, but the most creative force ever unleashed in the universe, capable of generating diversity, beauty, and complexity beyond anything that could have been achieved through simple reproduction alone. From the first tentative genetic exchanges between ancient bacteria to the sophisticated, romantic relationships that characterize modern human society, every innovation has been a bet placed on the future, a willingness to risk everything for the possibility of something better. So let me ask you once more, gently as I did at the start, where are you listening from tonight? And as you consider your location, your time, your comfortable bed, and peaceful surroundings, remember that you are experiencing all of this as the direct result of billions of years of successful reproductive gambles placed by ancestors who couldn't have imagined the ultimate outcome of their choices. If you found any wonder, any comfort, any sense of connection to the magnificent sweep of evolutionary time in this quiet expedition through your reproductive heritage, I'd be ever so grateful if you'd like the video, maybe subscribe, and share this story of the greatest gamble ever taken with someone else who might need to be reminded of just how extraordinary their existence really is. You are not just the product of evolution. You are its most sophisticated achievement, the temporary culmination of the greatest experiment ever conducted, the living proof that sometimes the most beautiful outcomes emerge from the willingness to risk everything on the possibility of love. Sleep well, fellow descendant of cosmic gamblers, wherever and whenever you are, knowing that you represent the successful outcome of the greatest bet ever placed in the history of the universe.